There's a story of a man who met God on the road one day when he was out walking. And he was very excited to meet God. And he said, I'd like to go further with you. And many things to ask you. You can teach me a lot. So God said, yes, I'll be happy to talk about it. But he said, I'm a bit thirsty. Would you mind going and getting me a glass of water? So the man went to a nearby house, and this very beautiful girl opened the door. And he said, would you mind if I had a glass of water? And she said, no, of course, come in. Actually, I'm having lunch. If you'd like to join me for lunch, you can have lunch. So, 50 years later, and 20 grandchildren, the man had many questions to ask still, and went in search of God and found God at the same place on the road. And God said, did you bring my glass of water? And the story, I think, is essentially about not wasting time and the patience of God. And in the divine dimension, in the spiritual dimension, time has a different quality and different sense. But we live in time, and we evolve in time, and time matters. And the decisions we make are of real importance. So, the question I think we are asked by this season of Advent is, how are we in time, and how do we use our time, and how do we allow the sacred dimension of time to transform the mundane workaday dimension of time. St. Augustine, as I mentioned, says that we all know what time is until we try to explain it. And he was asked once, what was God doing before he created the world? And Augustine's answer was preparing hell for people who pry into these mysteries. So there are some questions, some kinds of questions that we can ask and play around with, but we shouldn't expect verifiable answers to. But Einstein came to the same idea as Augustine, that time came into existence at a certain moment that we call the beginning. And that time depends, of course, on matter and gravity. Without matter, there is no time. In the material world, time is a constant. And as I've been saying, we experience time in different ways, long and short. We fast forward, we rewind, and many of our ideas about time are probably related to our technology of recording things. You know, we can record these talks and play them back, and is this moment actually being repeated? What aspect of it is being repeated? Clearly we're looking back in time, but we don't have to remember it because it's all been recorded. But whether this really explains time is another matter. But we have, our technological approach is something we need to take into account, and to see that time is more than a sort of recording and the recorded events of the past. To understand ourselves, to understand the different phases of our life's narrative, and in many ways we understand ourselves as a story. We are writing, or we are being written as a story, our life story. This is something we are aware of and transmit to others, and understand ourselves through the story. But of course, the story is always being added to, and the meaning of the story is also being changed by new events. But in order to understand it, we have metaphors. We have ways of describing the experience. If we take the metaphors literally, we miss the meaning. That's the problem of fundamentalism. When they take the words of Scripture literally, they miss the meaning. When we suspend the metaphors, when we stop thinking about the experience and describing it, and just rest with it, stay in it, then the meaning reveals itself. So when we suspend metaphor, as we do in meditation, we experience time more clearly, and we understand it more intuitively, more directly. So that translates into that we are more at ease with ourselves. We are less stressed, we are less anxious, we're less fearful, because we are experiencing time and the meaning of time, the meaning of our journey, from this place of stillness, this place of the eternal now, in the spiritual dimension. So we're able to walk across the bridge, or to connect the daily events of time, the work we still have to do on the past, the jobs we have to do today, and planning for the future. We're able to do that, handle those dimensions of time from a much deeper and more stable sense of being in the present moment. But this capacity to live differently, it depends upon our doing a radical work of simplicity, the work of contemplation, the work in which, on the one hand, it seems like a renunciation, on the other hand, is a way of receiving immeasurable gifts. If we focus just on the renunciation or on the discipline aspect of it, we miss the point, of course. So John Cassian describes meditation as the renunciation, or the letting go of all the riches of thought and imagination. That brings us immediately into contact with poverty of spirit. The first of the Beatitudes, the first of the conditions of happiness in the way that Jesus understands happiness. So poverty of spirit is something that we experience, we cultivate, we commit ourselves to in our daily meditation. We commit ourselves to it by the renunciation of thought and all the riches of imagination. So we're not thinking about the past, we're not dealing with the problems of the day, solving the problems of today, and we're not planning for the future in those times of meditation. Now, the mind continues to play its tapes and to act out these habits and functions, but increasingly, with practice, we can let go of that and allow it to just carry on, if necessary, in the background, while we are focused in the center on this work of the mantra. So the mantra, we say the mantra even through distractions, or keep returning to it when we become interrupted. And even if the background noise in our minds is very high because of what we're going through at the moment, problems or issues we have, nevertheless, we know that the center of gravity, the work we are doing, is clear. It's the radical simplicity of the mantra. And that is our entry into poverty of spirit. And what we enter into in meditation doesn't end. It's not like Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's not the same in meditation. What happens in meditation overflows into our lives. Because the point of change, of enrichment, of transformation, the opening of consciousness that takes place in this humble, simple, childlike work of contemplation during the times of meditation becomes a formative influence in every aspect of our life. And therefore we see the benefits and the fruits of meditation. And if we don't meditate, because for any reason, for a while, we are aware of something missing. And it's usually that feeling that something is missing that brings us back to the practice. Not because we have to, not because we feel guilty, not because it's some super ego obligation we have to fulfill, but simply because we want to. This is exactly how children approach it. That's why when we teach meditation to children, we don't say, you should meditate twice a day for 20 minutes in the morning, in the evening. But the children who learn to meditate at school will say to you, most of them, that they meditate at home. They choose to meditate at other times. Charles knows that. And I asked...
And teach their family.
And teach their family even, yes, exactly. And parents often really learn from the children. And one little girl I asked, when do you meditate at home? When she told me. And she thought for a moment, and then she said, whenever I have a fight with my sister. How amazing. She understood, very intuitively, immediately, that when she has a fight with her sister, she's unhappy, she's out of harmony, she's out of love, and meditation will put her back into the right space of life, the right way to live. Imagine if that wisdom could be transmitted to the United Nations or to international conferences. Just experiential. So, as I was saying, we're often imprisoned in the past, repeating patterns, repeating the same script but with different actors, or we are anticipating the future, imaging it, predicting it, fearing it, trying to control it. And our culture has become dissociated, disconnected from the contemplative vision, the contemplative consciousness that children have much more easily and immediately than we do, because we've lost it, partly because of education, partly because of other things. But our whole culture today seems to be increasingly trapped in the past, on the one hand, and most of the violent conflicts that are taking place in the world are rooted in ancestral hostilities, living in the past still, and our relationship to the future is, to say the least, irresponsible. We are in a state of complete denial over what is coming towards us in the form of the environmental crisis. And yet, we are obsessed with control. We've become control freaks in every aspect, really, of life and society and government. We're producing more and more legislation, which is more and more confusing and contradictory very often. So we're into a very confused state. We don't have the clarity to be able to manage things well at all. So we see things breaking down. We see democracy itself breaking down. The two great pillars of supposedly, or the oldest Western democracies, Britain and the US, democracy is under great threat. So, our greatest need today is to recover, to reconnect, to restore this contemplative vision or contemplative consciousness. How we see ourselves today will determine the direction we take. That's always the case for us personally, but it's true for us as a species as well, as a human family. How we see and understand ourselves today will determine the future. And the understanding of ourselves is not just rational or analytical or biological or neurological or sociological. The self-knowledge, which is the real meaning of seeing ourselves as we are, that self-knowledge arises from an experience of being ourselves rather than just by thinking about ourselves. So those times of meditation have a real impact on our lives and because they bring us to self-knowledge, which is not just self-awareness, not a kind of mindfulness, but to a clear and pure experience of our own being in its uniqueness, in its wonder, and in its connectivity, the fact that we are connected, we are interrelated to everything. That's an insight we have, or don't have, about ourselves. Meditation opens the way, or opens our heart to that self-knowledge. And it's that self-knowledge which is redemptive and healing, because it involves us in the knowledge of God. We cannot know ourselves in this way without knowing God. Whether we name God or not is important, but not so important. The important thing is to know God. It is not those who said, Lord, Lord, who will enter the kingdom of heaven, but those who do the will of my Father. Lord, when did we see you hungry? When did we see you thirsty? When did we see you naked and clothe you? When you did this to the least of my brothers or sisters, you did it to me. So those who are saved in that great parable of judgment. Those who were saved did not at the time have the right answers, the right religious answers, but they were doing the right thing. They were being the right kind of people in relationship to each other. So it's this experience, and I think there's a great contemplative hunger, and it's not just a spiritual hunger, as we always say. Religious people always say, oh yes, nobody's coming to church anymore, but there's a real spiritual hunger out there. Well, I suppose there is, but we need to be a little clearer about what that hunger is. First of all, it's arising from a famine. There has been there is a religious famine. The religious institutions, the church, particularly in the West, is not responding to the religious needs of the time, of the people. In the same way, Jesus said, the sheep look up and they are not being fed. Well, we are not feeding ourselves. And the church is not feeding the spiritual needs of the people. And it is from the church, in the Western world especially, that this hunger for authenticity, for reality, this hunger for experience of God, for self-knowledge, it's from this it's from the church, especially in the West, but we could also say in many, many ways that the major institutions in other cultures are not responding to the needs of the people either. Because the hunger today, because of so much breakdown, so much confusion, so much disestablishment of religious authority, the great need today is for contemplation. And how many religious institutions are teaching it? There are a lot of secular institutions or movements or businesses teaching various forms of contemplative practice at different levels, in usually a rather superficial way, but at least they're doing something. And but where are we? What are we doing? Well, we are doing something, and one could look at the church. Ken Wilber said, Buddhism will not save the West. Ken Wilber is a brilliant and Buddhist-oriented philosopher and teacher. But he says Buddhism isn't going to save the West. It has to be a renewed form of Christianity. So, do we feel optimistic or pessimistic? Optimistic, good. Well, that question was asked of Charles Taylor, the philosopher who was taking part in our seminar when it was hosted in Belgium last year. And after listening to wonderful talks on the contemplative response to the crisis of change from different professions, and politics, medicine, education, science, somebody asked Charles Taylor, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic? And there was a long silence. So we were sort of hanging on to find out whether we should feel optimistic or pessimistic. And then he said, there is a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. Which is, I forget the name of the Marxist philosopher who came up with that. But anyway, I think that's a good formula, because if we don't have a pessimism of the will, because things are looking pretty bad, we're in denial in some form. And But if we see things as they really are, which is not very healthy, without an optimism of the will, then the worst is going to happen. There's a Chinese saying, if you keep going in the same direction, you will eventually get to the place you are going to. In other words, if you see yourself walking to the edge of a cliff and you know you're going to go over the edge of the cliff, then change direction before you get there. So this is where contemplation, the contemplative movement, you could almost say, that's arising in society at the moment in many different ways and from many different sources, including, to a small degree, within Christianity. But that this contemplative awakening is a revolution, because it is offering us a way of changing direction. And we can only change direction when we have the wisdom to see what is there and the courage, the insight to break with the past and to crucially see the difference between illusion and reality. So the best way for us to handle the future, which we should do, which we have a responsibility to do. Why? Well, because of the next generation. We have a responsibility to them. That's in the nature of being human. If we deny that responsibility, we are really dehumanizing ourselves. So we have no choice but to be concerned about the future. We can say, well, okay, the tipping point in the climate change is going to happen after my lifetime, so I'll be okay. We'll let the next generation handle the crisis. But if we do that, we are already dehumanized. And the great danger, I think, in our culture, in many ways, is a dehumanizing of our humanity. And I was struck by this in the work of Yuval Harari, who wrote immensely popular, two very popular books, Homo Sapiens, and then I think, what was the other one? Homo Deus. So I only read the first one because I knew what the second one was going to be like, because he describes it at the end of the first one. So I may be misrepresenting him, but I'm pretty certain I'm not. But I mean, basically, his survey of humanity, every so often, every 10 years or so, there's a new book that comes out with the history of everything. And it's very popular, it's very readable, updated information, very informative and interesting. So he gives this, one-volume survey of the development of humanity. There's no mention anywhere in this history of humanity about art, beauty, and the only mention of religion is that it created certain common myths that could unite a tribe in their socio-economic and political development. Basically, I think that would be true. So everything that we would call the spiritual aspect of humanity, including art and music and the great spiritual breakthroughs, of consciousness, completely not in the picture at all. And this book was immensely popular, because it's a complete secularization, or just seeing humanity and the history in terms of scientific development, of economic development, of organizational development, and so on. Now, if I'm misrepresenting him, I'm sorry, but that's how I read it, and others have seen it like that. But then he says, okay, now look at what a mess we're in the world today. What are we going to do? So, pessimism of the intellect, what he's described is, the crisis we're facing. And then the solution is, of course, we reinvent humanity. We re-engineer ourselves biologically, genetically. Pretty, well, yes, kind of robots. I mean, it's a surrendering of our humanity into some kind of a fantasy. It's a fantasy. It sounds scientific, but how we don't know what that means. And anything okay, I could take a gun with one bullet in it and experiment and see what it would feel like if I keep pulling the trigger. Well, yes, okay, we can experiment, and science is meant to experiment, but there are some things, some experiments, which common sense and a decency of humanity and self-knowledge of humanity would say, no, we don't do that. We don't do that sort of thing. We could say, Hitler had his solution for world problems, which was to exterminate the whole race, and because they were causing all the trouble. Well, that was an experiment. So there are some things we don't do, some lines we don't cross, because if we cross them, we become dehumanized. If we become dehumanized, it may be fun, but to play around with the idea, but it's not much fun to do it. It's like somebody I met many years ago who was sort of going through they started a sex change. And when I spoke to them, or they spoke to me about it, I just had this impression that this was not really something they were being driven to do by a biological need. It was a game they were playing. I mean, I'm not saying this is true of everyone who goes through needs, transgender and things, but this was my impression with this person. And it was a sort of a playing Russian roulette with yourself. And the one barrier that you could cross that is the ultimate one, or seems to be the ultimate one, change yourself in this way. And we spoke about it anyway. I think they came off it in the end. But so anyway, this idea that we will solve our crisis, or we will evolve by scientific self-manipulation, is deeply unsatisfactory. And so the second book, which I didn't bother to read, Homo Deus, presents humanity as self-creating. And it's very similar to a psychological phenomenon today, or maybe it's sociological, of something that was given a name. I saw in a newspaper the other day, some celebrity, some singer, a young woman who said that she came out not as gay or straight or anything, but she came out as self-partnering. Yes. Did you hear that? So she's just saying, I'm not into relationships, or I'm not into other people at all. I don't need them. I don't want them. I just, maybe she had a cat, I don't know. But she lived, she was just self-partnering. Well, that self-partnering sounds in contemporary, okay, I have the right to self-partner. Yes, of course you do. But is it an option, or that would lead, in that mentality anyway, and of course you can't judge her because I don't know why she's doing this, but is it an option, and this is the question, that would lead to a richer, deeper, fuller, transcendent humanity? And humanity without transcendence is incomplete, because we are built for transcendence. We can't be gods to ourselves, because then we become false gods and false to ourselves. So, all of this is to say that our contemplative teaching and practice and the communities that forms are of real contemporary importance, I think, for our time. And however small a contribution they may seem to be making to humanity, because we see the great tidal waves of disruption, of materialism, of scientism, where science becomes the answer to everything, and of increasing consumerization and individualization of people. So when we see all of these forces at work in our culture and our relationships, you might think, well, we Bonnevaux or our little meditation groups are making are they going to change the world? Well, we don't know. We just have to do the right thing. And the right thing is to be true to ourselves. If we are, we will then form groups, communities, or networks based on that truth of humanity. And if those networks and groups join together and collaborate, maybe there is an increasingly powerful alternative or response to the forces of darkness and the forces of dehumanization. And this is why I think for a Christian who enters into this contemplative work and consciousness and sees that Jesus is a teacher of contemplation, and if we want to follow Jesus, we should be following his teaching on prayer, and that the church needs to be educated or re-educated on this and self-educated on this, then I think we are also touching in, through a contemplative Christianity, into another essential aspect of Christianity, which is evangelical, which is to carry the good news, go forth into all the nations and carry the good news. But the good news is not just about the institution of the church and the sacraments and all of the things that we may hold precious in our religious identity, or some people do. But the good news is the very heart of the gospel that gives birth to all of this and gives meaning to all of these aspects of religious tradition, like the Mass, for example. And that only become meaningful again when we have reconnected with the core experiential dimension of faith. In other words, when we have gone into our inner room, the heart, and closed the door and sit there in the silence of the Father, the silence of the ground of our being. So this connects, I think, two aspects of Christianity that seem to be, for many people, in conflict today or irreconcilable, which is the contemplative and the missionary. But when you speak to missionaries, and I meet many missionaries who meditate, then the contemporary understanding of mission has changed totally. It's no longer about going out and baptizing the world and winning the world for Christ and putting them into the church and destroying the temples and destroying the pagans. It's not that at all. If it ever was that, well, it was that. So, yeah. So, but if it's probably not what Jesus meant. So what does it mean to baptize the nations? What do we baptize them in? Does it mean we have to get them into the church and have them legally, properly baptized? So what does it mean to go forth out of our comfort zone into the world, the secular world, the world of business, the world of medicine, the world of science and technology, and the world of addiction, the world of social justice, the world of environmental consciousness raising? That's the world we go out into to baptize.